for the recovery community and those that are struggling with addiction. And of course, to embrace diversity in all forms, including the largest Indonesian population in northern New England, right here in Somersworth. So I couldn't be more excited to introduce a candidate that represents the very concept of going home, of recognizing these forgotten communities of America, and bringing back life to our entire country. And I'm so happy that he's doing it here in New Hampshire's Rainbow City, introducing Beto O'Rourke.
Good morning. Buenos dias. Good to see everybody. Feliz cumpleaños. Her birthday. Let's hear it for the teetotaler and for Emma. Investing in this community. Making a great place with great coffee and great people. Thank you all for taking some time to welcome us to Somersworth, our second visit to New Hampshire. And a great opportunity not just to introduce myself, which I will try to do briefly, but to listen to you. To understand that this may only be the first of 4 or 5 visits where we get a chance to talk and you get to make up your mind amidst 20, maybe 21 candidates if Emmett runs as the favorite son in New Hampshire. So I want to make sure that I have that chance to have that conversation. That's why I've shown up and why I'm so grateful that you have as well. Emmett mentioned that I moved back to El Paso, something I never thought I would do. I could not wait to escape and to get away, to go find some place that had more energy, more music, more punk rock shows that I could go to. I remember, getting to see a few shows at this place called the Sound Seas in El Paso that would intermittently open and then close. I remember subscribing to this magazine called Maximum Rock and Roll, where you could read the interviews with your favorite bands and see the tour schedules, and I would see them stopping in Tucson on Tuesday and then playing in Austin on Thursday. I knew they had to come through El Paso at least to gas up, but they weren't stopping to play music. So I got to go to school in New York. I got to live and work there afterwards. But then something was calling me back. Certainly my family, the weather, the mountains, the Chihuahuan desert, the food, something, some purpose that was missing from life in New York. I knew I wasn't going to be a New Yorker. I wanted to come back home and figure things out. But when I moved back to El Paso, I realized almost with new eyes that I had grown up in this embarrassment of riches, living in the largest binational community in the Western Hemisphere. 3 million from Mexico, from the United States, speaking 2 languages, 2 histories, 2 cultures, joined, not separated, by the Rio Grande River, forming something absolutely magical, more powerful than the sum of our parts or the number of people involved. I absolutely fell in love with my hometown, and I got after doing everything I could to help to tell our story. Started an online newspaper, StantonStreet.com, in 1999, and then in 2001 made the brilliant decision, as the rest of the print world was going digital, we take our digital publication print. It failed in 6 months. Undeterred, we continued to invest in another small business we had started, web design, then online software development, high skill, high wage, high tech jobs in a place that you might not expect to find them, in one of the poorest urban counties in the United States of America. But there was so much talent, and that talent spoke and coded in both languages, designed for both worlds. It was just waiting for a chance to express itself, and I count myself lucky to have been part of that. As Emmett said, ran for city council, served not as a Republican, not as a Democrat, just as an El Pasoan, trying to figure out how to make sure that we picked up your trash, how we kept the parks green, how we invested in our infrastructure. If you called my office, there was a good chance you were going to get me on the line to tell me about your idea for economic development, or to let me know that your neighbor's dog was barking, knowing full well there's nothing I could do about it, but you needed to let me know. And I knew. Held a town hall every single week, just like this, at the Village Inn restaurant for 6 years straight, explaining how I just voted on last Tuesday's city council agenda, previewing the next agenda, and then listening to you about your concerns, your questions about the votes I've taken, your ideas for new ordinances or opportunities that we could pursue. Though we had to find a way to come together, so we're just 8 council members and a city of about 650,000 people. In order to make those decisions, we had to find consensus. We never shied away from the tough fights, from arguing against a war on drugs that had become a war on people, and it produced the deadliest city in the world, bar none, our sister city of Ciudad Juarez. Kids, because of the premium placed on crossing marijuana, something that's now legal in most states of this country, willing to die or to kill for the privilege of crossing it. We took up that issue, spoke out against it. I wrote a book called Dealing Death and Drugs to provide our perspective. And then when I learned that city employees were not able to enjoy health care benefits for their partners if they were same-sex partners, we introduced an ordinance that ensured that we treated every single employee equally, regardless of their sexual orientation, and regardless of the fact that recall elections followed for those who had the courage of their convictions. Running for Congress against the odds, against an 8-term incumbent, we won by knocking on doors. I knocked on 16,000 doors myself. Showing up with the courage of our convictions, talking about what was important, but also showing up to listen and to learn. I knew we were onto something when I walked into a place just like this on a Monday or a Tuesday morning, and this guy stops me, and he says, "You must be Beto or work. You knocked on my grandmother's door on Thursday, and she invited you in, told you about her grandson that she is so stinking proud of, who's in the Marines, told you about her daughter who's a school teacher, who's having a hard time making ends meet. You talked to her for 20 or 30 minutes, and then you went on to talk to her neighbors, kept going on down the street. Well, that Sunday, following your visit, she had me and 31 of my other cousins over to her house for menudo, and made each one of us promise to vote for you. So, to paraphrase, he said something to the effect of, "Dude, I don't even know who you are, but you're going to win this thing, so don't mess it up." Once in Congress, we worked on the most important issues for our community, those issues that we had heard about at people's doors. I remember in January of 2012, I thought this guy was pulling my leg, a Vietnam-era veteran, who said, "You know what, Beto, if you want to help me, you're going to figure out how we can get the VA working, because I just called in January for a mental health care appointment, and they told me to call back in 2013, that there were no openings left this year." And I thought, well, this curmudgeon, this cranky old guy, he's trying to make a point to me. Turns out, he was absolutely right. We have the longest wait times in the country to see a mental health care provider for veterans who returned back from Vietnam to a country that did not understand or appreciate their service. The longest wait times for the woman who comes home tomorrow from Afghanistan, in a war that we've been in for 18 years. So we set about turning around the VA in El Paso, hiring up so that we had the appointments and the providers and the outcomes, and saved the lives that we were losing. 20 lives a day in this country. Veterans who take their lives by their own hands. 16 of those 20 unable, or for whatever reason unwilling, to go to the VA, perhaps because of the size of the lines that they wait in. We're able to turn that around in El Paso and bring what we learned to Congress, Republicans and Democrats alike. Important because I was in the minority every one of the 6 years, expanding mental health care access for veterans across this country and getting it signed into law by Donald J. Trump, a man with whom I agree on almost nothing, but where we could find some common ground to pursue the common cause, deciding we'll work with anyone, anytime, anywhere to advance the agenda of this country and the people we serve. We were able to do that. Ran for the United States Senate in a state you may have heard of that we call Texas. 254 counties, and I visited every single one of them. Did not matter to me how big or how small your town was, how red or how blue. We showed up to King County, perhaps the reddest county, not in Texas, but in the United States. Voted for Donald Trump 96% in the 2016 election. You can see it glowing red from outer space as you orbit the planet. But we show up there because they're every bit as deserving of our respect, of being heard, of being listened to, of being served. And we learned a hell of a lot by going to Guthrie, the county seat of King County. But we never trimmed our sails or showed up with anything less than what we believed in. Talked about reproductive rights in a state that is in the midst of a maternal mortality crisis because we have shut down so many of our reproductive planning clinics, making it that much harder for a woman to get access to a cervical cancer screening, see a family planning provider, see a provider of any kind in a state that has failed to expand Medicaid. So we talked about healthcare, meaning every woman makes her own decisions about her own body. No matter how red or how blue, we talked about the fact that in Texas, we don't have universal background checks. In Texas, we still continue to sell weapons designed for war, for that battlefield, into our communities. I remember a town hall in Wichita Falls. A Vietnam-era veteran comes up to me, and he says, that young man who just shot those school children in Florida was better armed in the halls of that school than I was in the jungle of Vietnam. This makes no sense to me, and it made no sense to me either. And so we advocated for an end of assault weapons sales in the United States of America. Never took a poll to find out how popular or unpopular that might be in Texas. Advocated for universal, high-quality, guaranteed health care because we were meeting people who were going to die of diabetes because they could not afford insulin. We met people who lived in a community where a school teacher died of the flu because though she had insurance, her care was not guaranteed. She didn't have the $119, which was the co-pay for her flu medication that would have otherwise saved her life. Because we were in too many meetings like these, where someone like you raises their hand and says, my brother gets arrested on purpose so that he can be taken to jail and so that his schizophrenia can be addressed. He can be prescribed the psychotropic medication that temporarily makes life bearable for him. And we learned that the single largest provider of mental health care services in the state of Texas is the county jail system in the state of Texas. We know that it's an incredibly expensive, immoral way to treat and fail one another in our state, so we proudly advocated for guaranteed, high-quality, universal health care for all, knowing that there are more than 1 million dreamers in this country, hundreds of thousands of them in Texas. We talked about making those dreamers U.S. citizens in this, their true home country, allowing them to contribute to their maximum potential and not buying into the paranoia and the hatred and the racism and the fear being fronted by this president about immigrants coming across the border. They are not rapists and criminals. In fact, they commit crimes at a far lower rate than do those born in this country. Asylum seekers, in the words of the president, animals and an infestation. You might expect somebody in the Third Reich to refer to a fellow human being as an infestation, as a pest or a cockroach, to be killed and to be stamped out. You would not expect that from the President of the United States. And meeting those asylum seekers in El Paso, we were able to tell their story. They are fleeing the deadliest countries on the planet today, doing what any parent, what I would do, what you would do if faced with the same choice. If to stay in your hometown meant the death of your daughter or your son, you as well would make a 2,000-mile journey on foot atop a train known as La Bestia, or the Beast, to come to a country of immigrants and refugees and asylum seekers to seek salvation and shelter. But instead of that, those families found their worst nightmare. At their most desperate and vulnerable moment, that child taken from that mother by force if necessary, that mother deported back to the very country from which she fled, that child placed in a cage, and then in the custody of Health and Human Services, and then literally God only knows where. Separated, visiting a torture and a cruelty on our fellow human beings that is unbecoming of us as humans, much less as Americans who cherish our freedom, our independence, our rule of law. So we shared the story of those immigrants and those asylum seekers. We urged us to follow our laws, to never again take another child from another parent, to reunite those who had been separated, and to rewrite this country's immigration laws in our own image, to reflect our values and our realities here on the ground in Somersworth or El Paso or wherever we live. Saying that El Paso, Texas is one of the safest cities in the United States, not despite the fact that we are a city of immigrants, but because we are a city of immigrants. We have an opportunity to meet every single challenge before us, whether those that I've highlighted or the single greatest, climate change. Because the scientists have told us that the floods, the fires, the devastation, the droughts that we are enduring right now is caused by our own emissions, our own excesses, our own inaction in the face of the science. 1 degree Celsius just since 1980, and it is going to get much worse along this current trajectory. We may not be able to live in Somersworth going forward, or in the desert Southwest, or in Houston, Texas, where 58 inches of rain fell from the sky. The landfall record from a single storm for as long as we've been keeping records in North America, and it was the third 500-year flood in just 5 years in Houston, Texas. But those scientists tell us that over the next 10 years, we have our last best chance to get this right, to free ourselves from a dependence on fossil fuels, to invest fully in renewable energy like wind and solar, to allow rural communities and farmers to do their part as well. Within the Farm Bill, allow them to plant cover crops at a profit, to pull carbon out of the air, use new technologies like precision tilling to disturb less of the carbon that is in the soil. That is the message that we took across Texas. And though we did not win, we lost by 2.6%. We gained more votes than any Democrat in the history of the state of Texas. We helped 2 Democrats win congressional seats long held by Republicans, helping to flip the House of Representatives so that they could move on with this country's priorities. We changed the composition of our state legislature, and we helped 17 African American women in Houston, Texas, the most diverse city in the United States of America, to win their elections, literally changing the face of criminal justice in that community. That same bold message about the challenges of this country and the way that we come together, not as Democrats, but as Americans, to resolve them. Writing nobody off, no matter how small your community is, how reliably blue or red, taking no one for granted, regardless of your voting history in the past. Showing up for everyone, everywhere, to hear what's on your minds, to incorporate what's most important to you into what is most important for this country. That's the way that I'm running right now to serve you as President of the United States of America. And I'm grateful to have the chance to be here with you. So if you've got a question or a comment or a suggestion, Cynthia Cano in the back with the black hat will bring the microphone over to you. Okay. Emmett, thank you for having us out.
It's going to be our first question right here.
Thanks. Hey Beto, my name's Dylan.
Hey Dylan.
I'm a 22-year-old recent college grad who lives in Dover. I am so scared of the climate crisis and the storms that are to come, like the ones that you talked about. But I know that for my whole life that the fossil fuel industry has been paying off politicians. Hold on.
Take your time.
But I know that you've also said recently that you are willing to not take any contributions from PACs and lobbyists and fossil fuel execs. But I read recently that you took some contributions from fossil fuel.
Tens of thousands of dollars.
But I know that we can do this without them. I know that we can win and build a better future. So I'm asking you, will you take the no fossil fuel money pledge, which means you won't take any contributions from executives, fossil fuel executives, lobbyists, or PACs that are over $200. This still allows fossil fuel employees to contribute to campaigns because they deserve to. And I know that we can build a better future. So will you take the no fossil fuel money pledge and do this with us?
Yeah. Thank you for being here. As you mentioned, I don't take PAC money and have not taken PAC money for approaching 5 years now as a member of Congress, as a Senate candidate, and now a candidate for the presidency. As you may also know, I take no money from any lobbyist for any organization.
$250 from a Chevron lobbyist on March 29th.
You know what? I'll give you the microphone. Here you go. So you don't have to shout.
Beto, I was really inspired to see that you said you would not take money from fossil fuel executives. But I looked it up and you did. You took the max contribution from 8 different fossil fuel industry CEOs and executives and a lobbyist from Chevron on March 29th. And that just makes it hard for us to believe that you're going to keep your promises to address the climate crisis. So we want to know, do you stand with us and the millions of people whose lives are being affected by the climate crisis, those people in Houston? And if you do, will you prove it today by returning that dirty money and signing the no fossil fuel money pledge?
Thanks for the question. Appreciate it. So you're right. I was just told as we drove in that we accepted on one of the last days of the FEC filing period a check from a lobbyist. We are returning that check from the lobbyist because we didn't get no money accepted from lobbyists. There's a reason that I'm here right now with you and with these kids and not with my kids back home, Ulysses and Molly and Henry, who are 12, 10, and 8. It's because I understand what is coming for them unless we take action right now. And I know that there is a way to do it, and I know there's a way to do it without excluding entire industries, without making people who work for oil and gas companies feel like they're the enemy, without coal miners feeling like they are somehow guilty of doing something wrong to this country or to this planet, bringing everybody into the solution that we have going forward. The single greatest industry that has contributed to our campaign so far, a campaign that has not accepted a single dime from a single political action committee, a campaign where 98% of our contributions are under $200, 99% of them came online and raised more than any other campaign in its first 24 hours, was public school educators and school teachers. So listen, I'm in this fight with you, and I know that you have a number of other candidates to vet and to ask questions of and to listen to their plans and policies. But I want to do everything within our power to make sure that we get to net zero greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible. I know that everything rests on the next 10 years, reinstituting the Clean Power Plan, raising the vehicle emission standards, investing in wind and solar like we have in Texas, believe it or not. We generate 4 times the wind capacity of the closest state behind us, and we've invested in the infrastructure, the transmission lines, the opportunities to be able to do that. I know that we can do that in solar, where we're investing in utility scale solar in El Paso right now. And yes, we must absolutely free ourselves from fossil fuels to drive our cars, our businesses, and our economy. And you've got my commitment to doing that. But I'm not going to write off an entire industry or group of people based on that. If we're going to come together at this very divided, highly polarized moment, we've got to bring people together, see common cause, and ensure that everyone is part of the solution. So thank you for being here, and thanks for asking the question.
Okay, here's our next question.
Welcome to Somersworth.
Thanks for coming
Hi,
out.
my name is Polana. I'm an ACLU voter. Right now we have 2 bills in the New Hampshire State House to address non-binary identities, both on driver's licenses and on birth records. We're fortunate enough to have one of the co-sponsors here today. And also, you are in the Rainbow City. So I am wondering, at a federal level, would you support the recognition of non-binary identities?
Yes. Yeah. And I'll tell you, perhaps, given where I am right now, in a community that has done so much to advance the equal and civil rights of all Americans, not just those who live in Somersworth. And from my perspective in Texas, where you can be fired based on your sexual orientation, where they just debated a transgender bathroom bill to scare parents about transgender kids, when we know that transgender kids are more likely to be the victims than the perpetrators of attacks. In a state that recently had 30,000 kids in the foster care system, and Child Protective Services so underfunded and understaffed that those kids were sleeping in the CPS offices underneath the desks. In Texas, you can still be too gay by law to adopt one of those kids into your loving home. I understand the urgency of signing into law the Equality Act. I understand the urgency of reversing the president's transgender troop ban to invite the participation and service of everyone. And I understand ensuring that everyone can live to their full potential. And I want to make sure that we do that as a country. Thank you.
Here we go.
Hi.
Hi, I'm here from Maine, and I just wanted to let you know that I think this is a fabulous crowd. I think it's fantastic. I think that what makes you stand out so much as a candidate is that on the one hand, you're so sympathetic to all of these causes, but on the other hand, you're always going back to the idea that everyone has to be part of the solution. That is so special about you and so wonderful. And back to immigration, you speak so eloquently and passionately about how immigrants will make our country strong rather than weak and all those wonderful things. I think something else you could offer as you, Beto O'Rourke, is your familiarity with South America and with Spanish and your credibility with South America as an American who is sympathetic. And so much of the problem isn't just that these people aren't being welcomed here, but the problems in South America that we don't deal with. You know, we deal with Europe, we deal with Iran, but
Yes.
South America needs something special.
Yes.
And I think to sort of rouse people to that kind of positive project
Yeah.
would be something that you could
Yeah.
bring, especially.
Thank you. Thanks for saying that. Let me add to what you just said. This next administration will afford us an extraordinary opportunity when it comes to foreign policy. I mentioned 18 years, or we're in our 18th year of war in Afghanistan. Without a definition of victory or a strategy or an end in sight, functionally we're in our 28th year of war in Iraq. We've been there since 1991 through each successive presidential administration. And then the 2001 authorization for the use of military force underpins our presence in Syria, in Somalia, in Yemen, in Libya, all the places where American lives are on the line, where far too often we lose them, and where we are taking the lives of countless other human beings in the name of this country, in your name and in mine. Not only ending these wars and trying to resolve our differences peacefully, cooperatively, bringing people together around the table to resolve this without using violence for the United States military. Not only can we meet the challenge of climate change, knowing full well that China has 3 to 4 times the coal-fired plants than the United States does. So even if we did everything within our power as a country, stopped emitting greenhouse gases this second, it would not be enough for the Earth. We can become the indispensable country again, convene the powers of the planet around this challenge, and then we can reprioritize, if it ever was a priority, this hemisphere. The people to whom we are literally connected by land, by culture, increasingly by language, and certainly by family. And it's not just that we have an opportunity to address their problems. Many of these problems are of our making. Guatemala, in the 1950s, this country, United States of America, overthrew a democratically elected government that threatened the corporate interests of Americans. And ever since, every year, every decade, all the way to 2019, Guatemalans had real problems with the legitimacy of the governments that followed, with the challenges in civil society and their institutions. Nicaragua and El Salvador, we involved ourselves in the 70s and 80s in their civil wars, exacerbating the violence and the outflow of refugees from those wars. We used Honduras as a military base for our presence in both those places. Those 3 countries right now producing so many of the asylum seekers that are coming here. And then those countries have the misfortune to be connected to us by land because we're 4% of the globe's population, but we consume 25% of her illegal drugs. They have to originate somewhere, transit through another country, and a war on drugs, militarized approach to the problem, has militarized those communities. And so people are fleeing. So what is the response to this? One, let's not invade another Latin American country, as this president is threatening to do in Venezuela right now. That will produce more problems. 2, Donald Trump wants to cancel $500 million, which is the totality of what we invest in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador right now. For some perspective, he wants to spend $30 billion on a wall. If we not only not canceled the $500 million, but at least doubled it, invested it in violence reduction in those communities, we have seen when we've studied this, that for every dollar spent, we're able to reduce violence, but we're also able to reduce the need for people to leave, make that 2,000-mile journey, and show up here in this country. So we have, I agree with you, a golden opportunity to get this right, to meet people not with walls, not with cages, but to address the challenges in their communities before they start that journey. That's the opportunity for the next administration. Thank you.
Hi, my name's D'Artagnan Stein. I traveled here from Somersworth High School with a little group.
Right on.
It's to my understanding that you... Oh, I'm sorry, it's kind of nerve-wracking.
Take your time.
That you held a sit-in with other Democrats on the House floor after the Pulse shooting when you live streamed it.
Yeah.
My question is, what are you going to do for gun control? Like, how are you going to present it to the U.S. citizens and elected officials? Because a day or two after punt went, we had a drill, and it was kind of scary, not knowing that it was a drill, and seeing like 25, 30 students running for the fear of their life is like excruciating, scary. I just want to know how you would address that.
Thank you for being here, and also for sharing your story. You did excellent. Perfect. And you personalized something that can often be reduced to numbers. As grave as those numbers are, more than 30,000 of our fellow Americans will be killed by gun violence this year until we change course every year going forward. But when you tell us about your life and your experience and what you felt, that makes it very personal for us. It reminds me of when our son Henry, who's 8 years old, came home from school and told us about going through an active shooter drill in his classroom. But he's so young, he just thinks that's what you do in school, that this kind of stuff just happens. Or if you saw the coverage of the Santa Fe high school shooting in Texas after that massacre, after kids were killed by a gunman. And they interview one of the classmates who survived, and the news reporter says, "Were you shocked that someone came in and started killing people in your school?" And she said, "No, I wasn't. I expected that would happen sooner or later." So what are the steps that we can take? Those moms who demand action that I've met all over the country, those students who led the walkouts from their high schools and the marches for our lives, have shared with us that those states that have adopted universal background checks have seen a near 50% reduction in gun violence. So we know that it saves lives to do the right thing, to defy the NRA and the gun lobby, and not worry about the next election or the polls, but the next generation and the lives of those in our communities. In addition, if we stop selling weapons of war that are designed to kill people very effectively, very efficiently, in very great numbers, and I mentioned that anecdote of the Vietnam-era veteran who told me that the shooter in Parkland, Florida was better armed than he was, had more ammunition than he did, could wreak more devastation on kids who were defenseless than he could against an enemy combatant. That's not popular everywhere, and I know that in some parts of Texas it was not popular. But we campaigned on it because we don't care about the popularity or the polls or the blowback politically. We care about your life and my kid's life and the lives of those around us. When you add to that red flag laws that say if you are exhibiting signs that you're going to be a danger to yourself or to somebody else in your life or my life, then we're going to have a due process through which you go to make sure that you cannot hurt yourself or somebody else. In Florida, young people your age got in front of the governor and the state legislature, and they made changes to their state laws in the immediate aftermath of that massacre, raising the age at which somebody could buy a firearm from 18 to 21. The House of Representatives, in part because all of us worked to flip the House of Representatives, now in Democratic control, 6 weeks ago passed universal background checks. So there is some cause for optimism, despite some insane, otherwise inexplicable outcomes, like Congress preventing the Centers for Disease Control from even studying gun violence in the first place, as though we are afraid to find out the truth. But those changes to the positive that we've seen are because of you and others who are asking questions, leading the effort, and a reminder that any significant change that we've seen in this country has always been purchased with the power and the effort and the advocacy of young people. So please keep it going. Thank you. Appreciate it.
I'm Derek Haddad. As an Arab American and history teacher, I'm concerned about our problematic relationship with both Saudi Arabia and Israel. And I'm just curious, what will you do to help our government restore our moral authority around the world, stand up to Netanyahu and the Saudi kingdom, and be better as good allies to the marginalized communities in Palestine and Yemen as allies to Israel and Saudi Arabia?
Great question. Thank you for being here. So with respect to Israel and the Palestinian Authority, the Israeli people, the Palestinian people, the best solution, in my opinion, is a two-state solution that ensures the independence and integrity of two distinct states, able to protect themselves and their citizens, ensure the full human rights of both sides. But it's going to take willing partners on both sides. On the Palestinian Authority, someone in Mahmoud Abbas, who has been ineffective in stopping the indiscriminate rocket fire into Israel or the incitement of violence. Someone in Benjamin Netanyahu on the Israeli side, who has sided with far-right racist political parties to ensure his victory at the polls, who has threatened to annex the West Bank, which would cancel any hope of a two-state solution. And Israel would be faced with the choice of deciding whether it's going to be a Jewish state or a democracy. I think it's in everyone's interest, primarily the interest of the people of Israel, for their safety and security, for it to be able to be both. A prime minister who warned about Arabs coming to the polls. We've got to call this stuff out. Saudi Arabia, which has been able to murder journalists with impunity, which is bombing indiscriminately in Yemen and bringing millions to the precipice of starvation and hunger and death. We are a co-combatant functionally and effectively in that war. We sell the arms, we provide some of the guidance, some of the refueling along the way. We are facilitating what is happening in Yemen to those people. The president just vetoed a bipartisan effort on the part of our representatives in Congress to put an end to our participation in that war. People around the world can justifiably wonder what it is that we really stand for. Is it for human rights? Is it for the dignity and respect of human life? Or is it relationships of convenience? A president who says that he's falling in love with Kim Jong-un, who tortures and starves his own people, has the blood of Otto Warmbier on his hands, who is building more weapons, not fewer weapons, and has done nothing to denuclearize the Korean Peninsula. Says that he believes, our president says that he believes Vladimir Putin, not the intelligence community, though beyond the shadow of a doubt, we now know after yesterday that Russia did everything it could to undermine our elections. If it is Duterte in the Philippines, al-Sisi in Egypt, our president has chosen strongmen, authoritarian regimes, and dictators over our democratic allies and our democratic principles. This is an opportunity for us. So yes, I would make sure that we no longer coddle or facilitate the bloodshed that we're seeing Saudi Arabia perpetrate with its neighbors. I'd make sure that we stand up and call out these strong men and authoritarian regimes. I would make sure that we reforge our alliances and our friendships, which are so much the part of America's success. But last thing, when we're talking about human rights and human dignity, we have to start at home. We have the largest prison population on the face of the planet. So whether you're talking about Saudi Arabia or Iran or North Korea or China or Russia, per capita we put more of our own behind bars than anybody else. And most of them are people of color. Far too many of them are doing time for non-violent drug crimes, including possession of marijuana, which is legal in most states in the Union. And yet people are doing time. Disproportionately, they are African American. Disproportionately, they are stopped and frisked, arrested, do time. Upon release, unable to get a job because they're forced to check a box on every employment application form saying that they have a conviction. No longer qualify for student loans because their conviction precludes that. Look what we are doing to our people in our own country based on race or country of national origin or ethnicity. So we've got to make sure that we're leading by example, but yes, that must extend to how we engage with the rest of the world. Thank you for the question. Appreciate it.
Hi, my name is Emerson, and I'm here on behalf of the Indigenous New Hampshire Collaborative Collective. My question for you is actually kind of a three-part sort of question, so I apologize in advance.
That's all right.
What will you do as president to uphold Indigenous sovereignty? Will you recognize treaties? And will you authorize the funding to investigate the disappearances of Indigenous women here in the United States?
Thank you for the question. The answer to your first question is yes. I was in New Mexico visiting with members of the Taos Pueblo recently and learned so much about their history and about our history as a country. We were looking at this gorgeous mountain, the Taos Mountains, which had been part of the Taos people's ancestral homelands for time immemorial, but which this government took away from them, restricted their access to. That was an important part of their religious rites and ceremonies, and was only restored in the 1970s by President Richard Nixon. And so I remember one of the members of the Pueblo said, many of my fellow Americans dislike President Nixon, but he is an absolute hero to us because he restored our sovereignty over these mountains and these homelands. I think there's much more that we can do on that front. Visiting the day school in the Taos Pueblo, I saw computer equipment that was from decades ago, in no way keeping pace with what they're using in Albuquerque and Santa Fe and El Paso and Somersworth, for that matter. They have to go through a bureaucracy in the Bureau of Indian Education, I believe, to be able to make any kind of purchase order, get any kind of help. And those children are receiving substandard equipment, and you might make the extended argument, substandard education. This gets even worse when we talk about the effect to functionally erase culture and language. They're just now reintroducing Taos native language into their curriculum after decades of this country trying to stamp it out. And so there are only a few native speakers within the school system beginning to teach those kids again. I want to make sure that that is funded. They have the resources to be able to do that, to hold on to it before it is too late. And I use Taos to illustrate larger challenges that we have around this country. And then when you make the case about law enforcement and our inability to pursue justice and the perpetrators of crimes and to prevent them from continuing to happen to women throughout this country, then we really have a challenge and also an opportunity to invest more federal law enforcement resources to make sure that we coordinate with law enforcement on reservations in these pueblos to make sure that the perpetrators are caught and these crimes are prevented from happening again. Lastly, would be very happy to work with you, learn from you, be guided by you if you're willing to work with us. I'll make sure that Cynthia or someone from my team gets your contact information so that I can understand more fully the story and the opportunities. So thank you. Thanks for being here.
This is going to be our last question. We'll have a few minutes outside if folks want to stay around to say hi or take a quick picture.
Hi, I'm Bobby.
Hey, Bobby.
Nice to meet you. Now, I've watched and participated and went and seen several candidates because I have a very specific question. What are you going to do to protect our news media outlets? Because it's not acceptable for them to get death threats. Yep. It's not acceptable for them to be called liars. These are the people that are holding Congress and that White House accountable. What are you going to do?
Yeah. I try to take every opportunity to describe the press not as the enemy of the people, but the best defense against tyranny. To describe in my own experience as a member of City Council, Congress, a candidate for Senate, now for the presidency, that though it's not always easy or comfortable to answer Leila Santiago's questions, it's necessary for you, the voter, to be able to make an informed decision. And so I do. The Mueller report confirmed that what had been reported in the New York Times and the Washington Post was accurate. And I'll tell you, as a member of Congress, privy to classified briefings about what happened to our democracy in 2016, I learned more on the front pages of those newspapers than I did from the briefings I received as a member of Congress. So 243 years into this experiment, that we're going to freely elect our own representatives, that we're going to have an informed citizenry that means a robust democracy, the press is a fundamental pillar, institution of our country, of our way of life, of any chance we'll have for another 243 years, or even another year or 2 years, given the threats that we face right now. But the incitement to violence from this president against Muslims, when he just tweeted the video of Ilhan Omar, a member of Congress, and conflated it with the terrorist attacks on 9/11, or who sought to ban all Muslims, and on the day that he signed that executive order, the mosque in Victoria, Texas was burned to the ground. Immigrants as animals, asylum seekers as an infestation, that's how you get kids in cages. And when you tweet video of a CNN reporter getting punched in the ring or hit by a train, then you get violence or an incitement to violence against the media, against members of the press. I'll tell you from the perspective of the US-Mexico border. I'm talking to my friends who live in Mexico, where it is one of, if not the most dangerous places to report the news in the world. And they are killing journalists in that country. You know, a slip can become a slide. If this becomes a new norm, a way of life, we are going to see that in this country. When the president came to El Paso, Texas a few months ago to hold some big rally to advocate for a wall and try to use us as a backdrop, there was a member of the press attacked at that meeting by somebody that he riled up because he'd invited people to act in this way. So yes, the integrity of the ballot box, fundamentally important. The judiciary, which he has also ridiculed, fundamentally important. Congress developing a backbone and a spine and putting this country over their party or the next election, really important. The press, fundamental for us to know what's going on and to make informed decisions in November of 2020 and thereafter. So thank you for asking the question. Thanks for standing up for the press. Thank you all for coming out. Emmett, thank you for hosting us. I'm very grateful. Happy birthday. Felicidades. Thank you all. Grateful. Thank you.